As India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi embarks on a state visit to Washington, which will also entail an address to a joint meeting of Congress on June 22nd, US India relations remain on an upward trajectory that began in 2000. Close to a quarter century later, short of India becoming a formal ally of the United States, it has established itself as one of America's most consequential global partners, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, where its increasingly assertive neighbor, China, is flexing its muscles. To understand what the Modi visit means for US-India relations, Mayank Chhaya Reports spoke to Arun Kumar Singh, a former Indian ambassador to Washington, as well as a seasoned diplomat with many crucial assignments in a career spanning decades. Arun Kumar Singh spoke to MCR from New Delhi. Mr. Singh, what's your overall view of India-US relations since 2014, particularly as they have gone through three presidents, Obama, Trump, and Biden? You presented your credentials to President Obama in 2015. How do you see the trajectory since you were here and perhaps even before that?
So, Mike, I would start looking at the new phase in India-US relations since 2000. That's when President Clinton visited India. And it was a clear indicator that the US was moving away from how they had reacted to our 1998 nuclear tests and the sanctions they had imposed. You'd recall that at that time they had been very strident in their criticism, very, very critical. But still, President Clinton tasked his Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot, to get into a deep dive discussion with India about what are our strategic compulsions, priorities, if they could explore convergence. And from the Indian side, the Prime Minister had mandated Mr. Jaswant Singh, who later became the Foreign Minister, the Finance Minister, the Defense Minister at various times. Now, through those discussions, they met, I understand, some 14 times spread over a period of 18 months, 10 different countries. There was a far deeper understanding between the two sides of how they saw their role in the world, what could be the opportunities for cooperation. And that led to the Clinton visit. And so since then, I think step by step, with each president, the relationship has evolved. Now you had a Democratic Clinton who starts the process. Then you had a Republican George Bush who really advanced it through the transformational civil nuclear cooperation agreement. And I recall that when President Bush was still in the campaign phase, speaking at the Reagan National Library in November 1999, he said that there is one country that doesn't get enough attention, and that is India. And India will be a force in the world. And then he tasked his administration to really find ways of advancing the India relationship. And you'd recall that when our Prime Minister Manmohan Singh met him in September 2008, towards the end of George Bush's tenure, and he said that when history is written, it will be recorded that George W. Bush played a major role in transforming the relations between the two democracies. And after that, we had President Obama, to whom I had the occasion and the honor to present my credentials. And President Obama took several steps. He was the first US president to visit India twice. He was the first US president to visit India on a Republic Day as chief guest in 2015. And no US president had done that before that. He articulated support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council. He declared India a major defense partner. And he invited Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2009 as the first state visitor of the Obama administration. And as you know, in the US, state visits are a rare thing. They do maximum 2 or 3 every year. In fact, Joe Biden has done 3 altogether in the first 2.5 years of his presidency. So those were important signals. Now, after President Obama, we had President Trump, in many ways a maverick, very unpredictable. But he sustained the India relationship. He put India on strategic trade authorization level 1. The same level of technology releases that the US does for its closest allies and partners, including NATO allies. And then you'd recall that he joined the Indian Prime Minister in Houston in September 2009 at a rally of 50,000 Indian Americans. Now, it's very unusual for a US president to join a visiting leader in a rally meant for that visiting leader. But he did so. Again, a signal to the relationship. And so from there, if you look at where we are under President Joe Biden, the relationship has continued to advance. President Trump had, for example, reactivated the Quad of India, Japan, Australia, and the US, first with official and then ministerial level meetings. Joe Biden took it to a summit level meeting. And they've met at the summit level several times, including recently when they were in Hiroshima for the G7 meeting. And under his presidency, they've started a new grouping called the I2U2, right. India, Israel, UAE, and US. Now, a recognition by the US and a signal by the US that it sees India as a partner, not just in the bilateral context, but in many other multilateral formats in different regions of the world. And so that's a new signal from the US. And then in January this year, the National Security Advisors of India and the US launched a major new initiative on critical and emerging technologies, talking about artificial intelligence, quantum, cyber, 6G, semiconductors, defense technology, commercialization of space, and saying that they want to build a new framework of partnerships in these areas, which are going to completely transform the way we live, the way we work. And so build new partnership, create new opportunities for skills. Now, in the framework of all that, President Biden has now invited the Indian Prime Minister to come to the US on June 22, 23 for a state visit. Now, that's a very high level of protocol, and the Indian Prime Minister, as I mentioned, will be only the third state visitor in 2.5 years of the Obama administration, of the Biden administration, after President Macron in December, the right. South Korean president in April this year. And also Prime Minister Modi will be only the third Indian leader ever invited to the US on a state visit. We had Dr. Radhakrishnan in 1963, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2009, and Prime Minister Modi. And it has just been announced that he is also going to be addressing a joint session of the US Congress on June 22nd. Now, that means he'll be doing it the second time. He did so in 2016, and that also is unusual. So if based on what I've described for you, the top line developments, right. It's clear that with each president, Republican or Democrat, since 2000, the relationship has continued to advance on an accelerating upward trajectory.
Right. Now, it's an interesting segue for me because the fact that they've just announced that Prime Minister Modi will address a joint session of Congress, people forget that the same Mr. Modi couldn't visit for 10 years. And when the Biden administration came into office, there were serious concerns that given their almost reflexive obsession with human rights issues of the Democratic Party, people were worried how the relations between Joe Biden and Narendra Modi might pan out. But it seems that's history now. Nobody remembers that. Do you think that's an accurate sense of it?
Well, let me put it this way, that when Prime Minister Modi was the chief minister in Gujarat, there were certain approaches in the US towards his visiting the US. There was some opposition. But once he was elected the prime minister, I think the US took the call that he is the elected leader of a major democratic country. And they have to accept the outcome of elections. Even in the US, they say that elections have consequences.
Right.
And so they have to accept the outcome of the elections and deal with the elected leader of India in that right. And so I think President Obama in 2014 took a very conscious decision that when the Indian Prime Minister was visiting for the UN General Assembly in September that year, also invited him to Washington for a bilateral meeting. And so I think from that phase on, clearly the past was behind in terms of how US looked at the India relationship or the role of Mr. Modi as the Prime Minister. And since then, he's visited US on several occasions for bilateral meetings, for multilateral events where he's had bilateral meetings with US presidents. And now on a state visit, going to be speaking to the joint session of Congress twice. So these are very important signals of how they are consolidating the relationship.
How much of this is driven by the US's well-known utilitarian impulses when it comes to dealing with countries around the world. They see a rather aggressive rise of China, which is now indeed a global player. And that's perhaps guiding some of the impulses that Biden and Washington are showing vis-a-vis the Prime Minister and India. Do you think that there is an element of that as well?
Look, man, my view is, and having dealt with foreign relations now for nearly 4 decades, international relations, every country is utilitarian. No country in the world makes a foreign policy decision really to help another country. They see where is the convergence of interest and what is the advantage to them from building that relationship. And so every country does that. And we have to advance our cooperation, exploring the convergence. Now, I have now studied India-US relations very closely for quite some time. And I've found that 4 factors have impacted the US approach to India. One is, what is the broad US global priority at a point of time? Second, within the framework of that priority, what is the US relationship with Pakistan? Because then that impacts on India. Again, within the framework of that global priority, what is the US relationship with China? Because that also impacts on India. And finally, what is the strength in the bilateral relationship? Therefore, who are the stakeholders in the US that are invested in advancing the relationship and protecting the various dimensions of the relationship? So when you look at these 4 factors, I think you can explain the relationship, the dynamics of the relationship at any point of time. Now, given that in today's context, the US has said repeatedly, they see China as their main challenge. They see China as the only country with the economic, technological, and military combined capability and the intent of replacing the US in the international system. So they have to respond to that. And they are building partnerships and working out strategy to deal with that challenge. And in this framework, they certainly see India as an important partner. And again, if you look at the statements and messages coming out from the US, they understand that even if India is not overtly anti-China, because India will take its decisions in its own interest, then a strong India in its own right is a deterrent to China's unilateral and aggressive posturing or assertive steps that China has been taking, for example, in East China Sea, South China Sea, along the LSA with India. And beyond that, of course, are the strengths in the bilateral relationship. The India-US trade today is $191 billion. It has increased about 8 times in the last 20 years. US is our largest trading partner. India is an important trading partner for the US. And if you look at the Silicon Valley, when I was in the US, I visited Silicon Valley several times. And I could see that Indian origin tech entrepreneurs, Indian origin tech workers were an integral part of US global leadership in innovation, including in digital technologies. So they also recognize the value of this partnership. So I think all these factors come into play as they look at the India relationship, as they want to advance it. And certainly the challenge they see from China is one of the important factors in this.
In specific terms, just as the 2005-2008 civil nuclear deal was seen as a major milestone, there are expectations that a new milestone would be created when very likely the transfer of F414 jet engine production to India is likely to be announced on this visit. Do you see this as a comparable milestone, or you see it in a different way?
So, Mike, I think a new milestone has already been created. And the F414, if it works out, will be a subset of that milestone. And the new milestone that was created was done in January this year, when the 2 national security advisors met in Washington and launched this new initiative on critical and emerging technologies. Right. And I think the broad assessment was that these technologies, and everybody says that, there's a perfect storm of technology coming. They are going to transform the way we live, the way we work. In these areas, work is just starting. And so far, while there's growing strategic convergence between India and the US, and we spoke about that, the economic and technological dimension of the partnership needs further strengthening. For example, as I mentioned, our trade is about $191 billion, but the China-US trade is $750 billion. So you can see the difference that is there. And yet, at the same time, when over the past few years, we've tried to work out limited trade agreements, even there we've not been able to succeed. For example, Indian ministers and others said in 2018 that a limited trade agreement is going to happen soon. Now, even till now, we've not had it. That's because there are existing interests on both sides. And you have to make concessions that block the concessions. So I think the idea is to create new framework for cooperation, new framework for production sharing, and from that lead to new kind of trading patterns that strengthen the partnership. So I think it is with this in mind that the two leaders, the two national security advisors launched this initiative, where they'll be looking at partnership in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cyber, 6G, semiconductors, commercialization of space, defense technologies, and that's where the GE engine comes in. Because the first reference to the US trying to expedite the processing of the GE engine transfer happened in the White House statement that was put out in January this year, after the meeting of the two NSAs on critical and emerging technologies. And again, this is very important because so far, India and the US have done fair amount of cooperation in science and technology. But most of it, for example, in science, was cooperation in science with the perspective of science. And then there were diplomatic spin-offs. Now the message is from both sides that we want to partner in technology from the national security perspective. That we believe it is in our interest from the national security perspective to deepen technology partnerships and to move to a higher level of technology partnership. Now, at a time when you're seeing that the US is restricting technology access for China on national security grounds, on India, the message is on national security grounds, we want to move to a higher level of partnership. And I think once this message comes out at the level of national security advisors, at the level of leaders, then the businesses in both countries, the academia in both countries will be enthused to explore partnerships in these areas. Otherwise, they would want to be reassured that when they move ahead with partnership in these areas, later the governments don't tell them to back down. And so the signal is move ahead. We are behind this. So I think that next big thing, the framework for that has already been created. The GE engine would be an element of that. And from what I understand, after January this year, the various bilateral groups that had been set up in the framework of partnership in critical and emerging technologies have had meetings. And they're trying to see what could be the next steps for this. And I'm sure there will be references to potential in this area, work that should be done in whatever comes out after the meeting between the Prime Minister and the President.
Right. Given the diversity of economic, technological, strategic, military convergences that you just enlisted, do you think it's time for India perhaps to become a formal ally of the US? That's not the case so far. And I know it's not just up to India to do it, but do you think the two countries should look at that as a possible objective, or it's of no particular consequence?
No, I think we should not do that. There are various reasons for that. At one level, India wants to maintain the strategic autonomy of its decision making, and that's very important. There is growing convergence between India and the US. There's growing strength in the bilateral partnership, but India's geographic location is different. India's historical experience is different. So there will not always be 100% convergence. So for example, on China, we see some convergence, but on Pakistan and Afghanistan, we don't see 100% convergence. The US withdrew in 2021 from Afghanistan out of their own compulsions. They did not factor in what would be the impact on countries in the neighborhood, including India. And so we have to understand that each country is driven by its own assessment of security consideration, its own domestic political compulsion. Now, recently, for example, the US has authorized a $450 million sustainment package for F-16s in Pakistan. Now, from the US perspective, perhaps it makes sense. They want to retain some access to the Pakistani leadership, particularly in the military. They want to signal that once they supply a platform, they try and retain its efficiency. But from Indian perspective, that's a negative development, because eventually, which is the country that Pakistan uses F-16s against? It is India. So what we have to understand that there will never be 100% convergence in compulsions or national security consideration of all countries. Secondly, you've been in the US and you have watched processes in the US. US decisions are based on their own assessments of their own interests and political compulsions of the leaders. Now, where, of course, there's convergence for a country like India, you work together. So I think the India-US relationship can be sustained even better if we are not a formal ally. And if both of us allow space for differences from time to time. Now, I think, for example, the US, I believe, has handled very well the fact that India does not agree or has not gone along 100% with the US position in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Because India has a legacy relationship with Russia. We still have 60% of our defense inventory of Russian origin. Historically, the Soviet Union and Russia have been supportive of us politically when we were under pressure from the West. And so the US, factored that in. And the Secretary of State has said on a number of occasions that, in Russia became a partner of India of a kind when US was not willing to be that kind of a partner.
Indeed,
or the National Security Advisor said that with India we're playing the long game. So I think both of us have to allow space for some differences in the options, but look at the longer term convergence, the longer term benefits, and work on that basis. That's why I believe that if we retain this option of differences from time to time, it will give more stability to the relationship.
The predominant sense in the aftermath of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan is that the so-called hyphenated approach that Washington had vis-a-vis Islamabad and New Delhi has almost completely, now it's tilting towards New Delhi, as we just discussed. Do you think that, and also add to that the fact that Pakistan is firmly in the Chinese orbit now, do you think that hyphenated approach is history?
I think the hyphenated approach is history, and the process started again in 2000. When Bill Clinton came to India, for example, in 2000, he was here for around 5 days. On his way back, he stopped for a couple of hours in Pakistan. So that differentiation started. And now when US leaders, presidents and others come to India, they don't necessarily visit Pakistan. So that and again, the fact that US did a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with India in 2008 and has not done any such thing with Pakistan was a recognition from their side that they saw India as a responsible country in terms of advanced nuclear technology, and that India had not built up its capabilities based on inward or outward proliferation, whereas Pakistan had indulged in inward and outward proliferation of nuclear technology. So that dehyphenation really has happened quite significantly. I think what is still there is that they see Pakistan as a country that has nuclear capability, has nuclear weapons, and therefore they feel that they must continue to have some access to the Pakistani leadership, even if Pakistan is in the Chinese camp, and even if on US-China issues, given a choice, Pakistan will be with China. Secondly, the Af-Pak region still continues to be a region of concern as far as terrorism is involved. And the US, from all reports, still sends drones over Afghanistan. And for that, the country that they need to fly over is Pakistan. There's no other way they can reach Afghanistan. So for these various reasons, the US needs access to Pakistan. Therefore, they'll maintain a relationship. From time to time, they will try to do things to, in a sense, in inverted commas, reward the Pakistani military for the support that they're given, hence the sustainment package. But the dehyphenation has happened. I think the US-India relationship has really moved to another level in terms of economic, technology, and the people-to-people dimension of the partnership. We have 4 million Indian Americans in the US.
And finally, to conclude, in the specific context of the existential crisis in Pakistan, and given the fact that it's a nuclear weapon state and this kind of instability is definitely a matter of grave concern, not just for India, but even the US. How do you see Pakistan? Where do you think it's headed? I know you may not have particularly focused lately on that, but overall, what's your sense sitting in the neighborhood?
Mayank, for about 10 years of my career, till about
Yes.
2005, I was involved in handling India's relations with Pakistan, and I've
Right.
watched the processes in that country. Well, clearly they're going through a difficult time. The army has been the dominant force in Pakistan virtually since its independence. For 60% of the time, they rule directly, rest of the time, they rule behind the scenes. From time to time, political leaders have emerged that have challenged the army, but eventually the army has worked to remove them from the scene. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto challenged the Pakistan army, they eventually hanged him. Nawaz Sharif was initially a creature of the Pakistan army and the ISI and President Zia. And eventually he took on the Pakistan army and they did a coup against him. Imran Khan was built up by the Pakistan army to keep Nawaz Sharif in check. And then the political leaders, once they come in a seat of power, develop their own motivations and compulsions. And then Imran Khan has begun challenging the army. Now, this time, for various reasons, at the popular level, it did command some support. But so the army, its ability to take him on immediately was not so effective. But if you see since then, step by step, they've taken measures to weaken him. Many of his close partners, political allies, are abandoning him. And so clearly what the army will try to do is weaken him, delegitimize him, and once again re-establish itself as the commanding force within Pakistan politically. So that's where it seems for now. But Pakistan is going through a very difficult economic situation. And that's because, large part of their budget still goes to the army. And the army wants to control politics to keep getting this huge chunk of the Pakistani budget. So that's an important challenge that they face.
Just one fine point that I forgot to mention. Rahul Gandhi, on his current visit, he said it twice in the context of Ukraine-Russia standoff that his government's policy would be very similar to what the Prime Minister Modi's policy has been. So there is still that political consensus in India when it comes to Russia.
No, I think two things. One, there is a consensus in India about maintaining the autonomy of our decision making. And that's a very firm. The moment I feel that there's ever a perception in India that India is subjugating its decision making to another country, there'll be a huge blowback for that relationship. Therefore, this perception that India is able to take decision in its own interest. So on that, that's a very important factor. There's a broad consensus on that. And the second, there is a sense in India that, look, the Soviet Union and then Russia were with us at times when others were not with us. And therefore, you can't ignore that. And then beyond that, ultimately, every country looks at an issue from its own perspective.
Right.
And therefore, certainly, the Prime Minister told President Putin that this is not an era of war. Certainly, India has taken repeatedly the position that it supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. But beyond that, given our own relationship with Russia, it doesn't make sense for us to get publicly into condemnation or criticism of Russia or voting against Russia. Because again, on the India-China issue, it's important for us to prevent Russia from going over to China on India-China issues.
Right.
And so that's again a very important consideration.
On that note, Mr. Singh, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Hopefully someday soon we'll talk about the neighborhood at greater length. I really appreciate your time. I'll send you the links, I think sometime by tomorrow or over the weekend. And wonderful to meet you finally. I mean, I've been tracking your work for quite some time, so I'm aware of what you do, but we never met before.
Well, thanks, Mac. I look forward to being in touch. And thank you for conducting this conversation very effectively and keeping
wonderful.